Please don't make the mistake in thinking that this is an anti-Christian video at all. After all, I spent 11 years of my life dedicated to the church, my adult life. Initially, I joined the church because I decided it was the principal form of self-development and spirituality within this country at the moment, and I didn't have a real practical working knowledge of it in terms of actually doing it. And it was okay for me to be a younger person who's got a few issues with the church and so on and so forth, but on the other hand, how right were those issues, and was it appropriate for me to hold any animosity against the church? As a result of having read books on chaos magic when I was young, many of which suggested that you can't actually understand what it means to be something until you've actually been that thing, I decided I would take the church seriously. This seems like a rational solution at the time, both for my own personal self-developmental issues, as well as the need to develop some professional skills that one can only really gain through attending meetings and committees and that sort of thing. But also from my own point of view, I've made a decision that essentially all the religions in the world were essentially of the same order, no matter what. There's always a belief in a higher power, an explanation for death and what could possibly be happening after death, and attempts to try and understand what goodness could possibly be. As well as, of course, all of the things you do together in a community, such as the worship, the hymns. It's all rather nice stuff, really. In short, it's all very wholesome stuff, all very appropriate. That seemed to be okay. I also had a sneaking suspicion that there might be the possibility that I could be being taught some more powerful introspective tools in order to try and help me with my personal growth due to certain passages in the Bible. What I found most interesting about my experience of the church is it wasn't actually a negative environment at all. Of course, it took me a little while for certain people to find out what I actually do for a living, and therefore for my presence within the Church of England to regretfully come to an end. Although it was a shock when it happened, it was somewhat inevitable, taking into account the attitudes and values within church circles towards things that they regard as being a bit different. When you were in the church environment and you had gone through the baptism and confirmation and had started to participate more, were invited to do things in the services and so on and so forth, you then get accepted. It's a good experience. People's behaviour change towards you and you become an in-group member. But at the other end of my experience, at the end of my 11 years, I had learned full well that if there is something about you which is in conflict with some of their ideas, that affects things quite substantially and things start to get a bit awkward. I think that's one of the first things the church needs to work on, really. Especially in terms of what their definition of right and appropriate and what wrong and inappropriate really is and why they have it. Also, different people within different church communities perceive very differently the subjects of what it means to be loving. For some, it means supporting people no matter who they are. For others, it means having some very serious and probably rather traumatic conversations with people who are of, in one example, LGBTQ plus orientations, transgendered and the like. This creates some complexity, especially as the church itself sells itself as being something which preaches love, but plainly doesn't fully understand in depth or in precision or indeed in terms of total universal understanding amongst all the churches what love really is. But we don't always know what a precise definition of love is, so what is it that churches are selling and why are they selling it? I believe the church is still wrestling with this and still doesn't actually know what is right and what is wrong, which is, again, a bit of a complexity and a shame. Also, my impression is that the denial of the approach towards gaining spiritual experience doesn't actually help at all, and possibly even muddies the waters even further in a negative way. After all, Christians are encouraged to believe in a God which they have not experienced. The people are not encouraged to search for spiritual experience and are just asked to rely upon interpretations found in biblical text, much of which we know has been adjusted by political editing over the years. And on top of that, many of the values which are expressed in the Bible may have been appropriate for the place and the time, let's say the Bronze Age and all that stuff in the geographical location at that time, but aren't necessarily appropriate now, considering we've had an increase of knowledge and understanding and growth in science and technology, and we understand the human being much better. Don't get me wrong here, my impression of the church is still very positive, despite the fact that I have left it 2 years ago after having had a rather complicated conversation with a rector, who'd had a conversation with the archdeacon, who previously had a conversation with a member of my own congregation, who disapproved of what they considered me to be. The roles that I had within the church included being a deanery synod representative, and this involves reporting back to the parish committee and church committee the decisions and discussions that were made by the deanery synod. I was privileged to attend many interesting presentations and communications both about charity work as well as the oil and gas industry and the way in which the Church of England was appointing its investments. Also lots of presentations about both the good and bad Christian policies towards minorities, and some serious discussions about how to improve the infrastructure of the church so it could do more charitable work. The number of charities associated with the church is massive, and even if you are not Christian but you need some charitable help, I would strongly advise searching for which church charities could possibly be of use to yourself. So the quantity of good which the church does is in fact quite vast, really, despite the fact that we don't necessarily agree with their theology or indeed some of the political attitudes which are present within the church. Another factor of the matter is that these various tools which I deal with in my day-to-day life, such as the pendulum, the runes and the tarot, they're all part of the inner journey. Although off the top of my head I can't remember where it is in the Bible, there is one particular section which I believe was spoken by Jesus himself, suggesting that people needed to clean the bowl out from the inside as opposed to just the outside, thus suggesting a very deep and searching catharsis and healing of the mind and spirit. In the 11 years in which I was in attendance in every single church service and every single home group and every single Bible study, as well as in meetings for the church committee and parish committee, as well as deanery synod, and of course even worshipping at our cathedral once a year, this particular concept was never expanded upon. If my memory serves me correctly, it was the voice of God which was supposed to be teaching people to look closely at their inner structure and to work on their inner being. Although the following of religious tradition does assist in this matter, I really do not believe that it is sufficiently in depth in order to clean the bowl out from the inside, which means that more searching, challenging, brave, looking at what's really inside the person is essentially what the Bible was talking about, but it's not being preached in Christianity. It is, to my mind, in part, the craving for the solutions and answers to life's problems and the identity of what it means to be a human being which has led people to start looking into shamanic spirituality. Whether this is just psychological or whether this is more in-depth psychological stuff using meditation to access the deep recesses of the mind, or for the purposes of generating some variety of spiritual experience. And of course, these days with things like microdosing and psychedelic therapy, people are interested in these things. There is, within a certain demographic of humanity, a craving for this stuff. The church tends to believe that the concept of the coming of the kingdom of heaven, when everything will be made right. How can everything be made right if the people themselves are not made right as a result of some kind of deep and spiritual cleansing? Which would, of course, involve analysis and experience as part of the process. Instead of demanding the acceptance of the sacrificial crucifixion and the obeying of rules, the church could actually try and do what Jesus Christ was telling them to do in the first place, to develop the same loving attitudes which happens within the tribal communities in the ancient times prior to the development of city-states. A bit like the way in which we imagine the First Nation Americans would have lived in their nomadic lifestyle prior to the coming of the white man. I also don't understand why the church themselves has not made it their task to study each and every single form of healing therapy which is out there in the world, and to work out which ones are most effective and efficient and to be able to teach them. After all, their key prophet was a healer according to their text. So what could the church actually do in order to modernise and become much more acceptable to the world? The first thing the church needs to do is to start working on the subject of the inner journey of meditation, and turning the inner journey into a principal method of worship, to be able to have a fixed definition of what it means when the time of the coming of the kingdom of heaven is coming, but also to try and lead up to have the ability to challenge words based upon the era in which they are written. The church should actually encourage supernatural exploration, because how can a person believe in God if they don't even understand the most basic level in which the divine can actually manifest? Also, the church needs to be a place where people go to find out about healing therapies, of which there are many, including spiritual healing, and of course my favourite, which is Rife therapy via the Spooky 2 system, which I'm totally into because it works very well for my body. And also I believe more strongly that it is the role of the church to challenge the government and to be much more proactive in terms of chastising the government for their wrongdoing. The church itself isn't actually evil. It's just yet another combination of human beings. And that means it will have the same diversity of politics and psychological diseases as any other gathering of humans. Maybe one day it'll sort itself out. Who knows? On another note, I'm actually incredibly pleased that we're now moving into a world where we can start to see the blurring of the lines, and that essentially we are all one. That means all humans. Some of the ways in which new movements and religions have been developing over the past few decades have been about parodying the negatives of the church. This has its importance in the narrative. But nowadays we also have things like the Christian witchcraft movement, which also has a very strong biblical justification for its existence and attitudes and approaches. Again, as far as I'm concerned, proof that we're all one, really. Hopefully, as people start to see that it is important to blur the lines between these different groups, that there will actually be some progress. Don't forget to click the bell, subscribe, and rate with a thumbs up, and I'll speak to you again soon. Keep cool, more tarot videos coming.